My name is Mathew Drewno. I work with Ecology Action, and I got into gardening at a young age and was working with my mother in the garden. I was the professional weeder of the family, so I did a lot of yard work when I was younger. So that's kind of where I first started with growing plants and working with the soil. Started touring different farms and different gardens, came across this man named Chadwick. Chadwick was a biodynamic French-intensive gardener, a horticulturalist, who had studied with Rudolf Steiner. He was a direct descendant of what Rudolf was teaching. Chadwick was invited here in the 60s and started a school garden at the University of California, Santa Cruz. That school garden at the university, this experimental university that was getting started at the time, became controversial for the university itself because people were dropping out of school and working full-time in the garden. Thousands of people were exposed to his garden there. And so the university and Alan sort of had a falling out. And in the meantime, there was a mass falling in with Alan's work, striding right in line with the hippie culture of the time, the Back to the Land movement, and many, many people were exposed to what Alan was doing. So he started a number of projects, which is where my current boss, John Jevons, was exposed to his work. John saw his work and was speaking with Alan's apprentices and realized that this was something that had some real potential. Alan put the soul into the work, John saw that and started quantifying it scientifically and realizing that this type of agriculture, which Alan brought, the French intensive method, which was combined with biodynamics. The French intensive method was what the Paris market gardeners used in the 1700s and 1800s and is known widely to be some of the most productive forms of agriculture on the planet. One of the reasons why it was so productive was because they used vast amount of manures. When John got into this work, he realized that he had worked with USAID, he had worked with universities, he had studied political science at the University at Yale, and is much of a systems thinker himself. He started looking at where human beings were in the 60s and 70s and projecting into the future and paying attention to UN reports and different government agencies and realizing we were in for something huge. We needed to address the situation sooner than later. And the sooner that we did this, the more chance we would have a peaceful and sustainable world. So John took what Alan was doing and started scientifically quantifying it and realizing how productive this was. And realizing that mechanized conventional farming, be it organic, GMO, or whatever, didn't quite meet the needs of the future, that there's some real strong challenges. For example, the UN predicts that by 2050 we have to double our agricultural output. The challenge there is that every year we're using and losing tens of billions of tons of soil. So how do we keep losing all this soil and then at the same time double our agricultural production? So what John started investigating in the 70s and building up towards today, which is what we call the BioIntensive system, which generally means no tractors, no fossil fuel inputs, reducing water consumption, conserving resources, and building soil while increasing yields. That all falls within our definition of what biologically intensive agriculture is. John realized that that's the name of the game in the future. That's the only game in town. It's an actual micro-scaling of the human footprint that needs to take place. Not people buying vast tracts of land and planting huge acreage of polycultures, monocultures, whatever, but actually micro-scaling the human impact on the planet. And in addition to that, by micro-scaling our impact, we're able to give more to nature and restore and conserve ecologies so that we have functioning climates. For example, we know that forests help us create clouds, create stable weather patterns. They also bring up water in the aquifers and make it available in our streams and ponds and rivers and ultimately our oceans. And those hydrological cycles are important and rely on functioning, intact ecosystems. So the name of the game in the future and what we look at with biointensive is how do we provide the human needs in the smallest amount of space possible while giving back more than we take to nature? And in the process, grow community, relocalize our economies, and create a peaceful, abundant future. We've grown food in virtually every soil and climate where food can be grown. And we've created a worldwide network of community-based teachers We don't go overseas to teach people how we do it. We fundraise and bring community leaders who want to know this work and want to contribute to it and believe in a peaceful future. We train them with this method. We create a dialogue with what they do and how that fits within this and how what we do fits within their culture. And every year, the method is refined. And so the biointensive method is these 8 basic principles, a pattern language that can be applied anywhere around the world to help people raise food immediately and help this transition into the peaceful future. So this garden here is called Victory Gardens for Peace. We're a project of Ecology Action in partnership with the Stanford Inn in the town of Mendocino, California. We do apprenticeships and internships, workshops. We have a local seed bank with over 200 varieties of seeds that have all been locally raised here in this community, in this unique coastal environment in Northern California. We also train people from around the world. We have people who we trained a few years ago that work for the UN in the Chinampas of Mexico, where they're trying to revitalize the agriculture there within the city. And we've worked with people in other countries from Sri Lanka, Kenya, Senegal, all over the world. As mentioned before, the biointensive method is 8 basic principles that can be applied anywhere in any culture, any climate, any soil where food can be grown. And in fact, it has been. These 8 basic principles were derived from studies over the last 45 years of agricultural practices throughout the world and throughout history, with a best practices approach to backyard gardening and sustainable agriculture. These methods can be in the scale of a backyard, and they can be upscaled to farm scale over tens of acres, working in cooperative mini farms. But always keep in mind that the goal of this is to also microscale the human impact while preserving and conserving and restoring ecologies. These 8 basic principles, the first of which is deep soil preparation, the second of which is close plant spacing, the third of which is companion planting, the fourth, composting, the fifth, carbon farming, the sixth, calorie farming, the seventh, open pollinated seeds and seed saving, and the 8th, a whole systems perspective of agriculture. These 8 basic principles are the foundation of this work. And what you see around you in this garden, which we'll take you through and give you a brief tour of these principles in action. These basic principles increase yields while reducing water consumption to about 1/3 of what it usually takes to grow a complete diet, and reducing the needs for fertilizers 50 to sometimes 100%. Once we create a closed loop, we're able to recycle our nutrients within the soil, and we're able to give back more than we take and actually fix carbon, which enhances our soil. And we also are minimizing the energy of agriculture. The simple act of growing your own food means that you don't rely on transportation networks, the burning of fossil fuels in industry, to pack, transport, cool, drive to the store and back, which often takes more. You get more calories by growing your food than you do by going to the store and buying it. You actually spend more calories on the average trip to the store in the terms of fossil fuels and energy than you get from the few loaves of bread and eggs and veggies that you get from the store. So this is the Victory Gardens for Peace Seed Bank. It's part of our Victory Gardens for Peace initiative, a project of Ecology Action in partnership with the Stanford Inn. We've been working for the last 1.5 years with community members of Mendocino County, in particularly the coastal community. There's a network of seed libraries that's popping up all over the state, all over the country, and it's a really cool movement. You can go to your local library and just pick up seeds. So we wanted to do something similar here, but we wanted to make sure that all the seeds that we were giving out were local varieties that are proven to grow here. There's a couple things that we're doing with this seed bank. We're not just giving away free seeds, but we're also trying to build a network of seed savers on the coast, trying to figure out who's been doing it for a long time, how they've been successful with it, what are the things they've learned, what are their tricks, and make that information available to others who are wanting to learn those things. And we get together and have potlucks and do seed cleaning together and just share seeds. We now have almost 200 varieties of seeds that have been grown out on the coast. And it's a very special thing because the coastal climate we're in is salty, it's cool, it's moist. We rarely get above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. We rarely get below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. There's high salts in our water, high amounts of boron in our water. We also have the salt influence. The ocean's about 500, well, it's probably about 100 yards away. And so we get salt air that comes in, we have salt water in the ground, and we have salty soil. So what you see here is different varieties of crops. We have things like quinoa. We have really important crops that provide a lot of calories. You know, we're not just growing and not just providing the seed for lettuce and tomatoes, but we're thinking about staple foods here that do well on the coast. So we have quinoa, we have corn, barley is a fantastic crop because it's also salt tolerant. We have wheat, rye, triticale. We have a number of beans. Sunflowers do really well out here. We also have a lot of herbs that we make available, and maintaining the diversity of old and new varieties and everything in between is really important to a stable food system, because you never know. If you have a pest come in, you might find one of these old varieties is really special and is resistant to that pest coming in. For example, aphids on quinoa, we have a variety of quinoa which seems to repel aphids a little better than the others. And that could be for many reasons, but the fact that it works is really important to our local food shed here on the coast of Northern California. This is a really beautiful variety of quinoa that came from the Sacred Valley in Peru, outside of Cusco. There's all types of corn, and this one seems to do best as more of a flour type popping corn. Small kernels, but I don't know if you can see the colors on that, but just beautiful rainbow of colors. We owe so much to indigenous communities around the world for being the keepers of these seeds, and it's rare that we can find those seeds, and so making them more available, which is a service that Native Seed Search has done, is a gift to humanity. So they're also very unique to us because they have special varieties that can tolerate cold nights, and as I mentioned before, because we don't really get a lot of heat in this environment, things that tolerate the cold nights do really well on the coast. So as we regather farming literacy, as we reestablish seed saving in our cultures, as we start to understand the need for varieties that do well in our climates and situations, trying to build the network and the community of people that have that knowledge and making this accessible is what we're about, the Victory Gardens for Peace initiative. In the spring, we double dig. And so double digging allows you to prepare the soil 24 inches deep, instead of the normal agriculture goes anywhere from 4 to 8 inches or maybe 10 inches deep. When you dig the soil deeper, you increase nutrient cycling, you increase the ability for life to go deeper in the soil, and you increase the ability for water to infiltrate, and you increase the ability for plant roots to go down and get those nutrients. So when you do this, you can actually plant things closer together. So the first principle is deep soil preparation, which leads into the next principle of close plant spacing. So I can take this and go down 2 feet deep. A normal soil, before we did this, imagine a plant root trying to get into that. So plant root going into that can access more of the soil profile and just have a lot more chance at getting what it needs when you do the second principle of planting things close together. So you can see here our carrots, we actually transplant our carrots and we put them on 4-inch centers. You can see the density there. You can't transplant carrots that close if you don't dig the soil deep. So the art of this is trying to cultivate the soil, which enters oxygen into the soil, which increases the microbial communities in the soil, which eat your soil carbon and free the nutrients from the carbon bonds in the humus and in the compost that you add to the soil. So the art of agriculture is actually having the microbes eat your carbon, make the nutrients available, but doing that in a way that doesn't deplete your soil carbon. Instead of planting things in rows, which is really for mechanical cultivation, for getting a rototiller through the aisles or getting a tractor through the aisles, we do things the old-fashioned way, which is planting on close centers in a hexagonal type spacing. So when you see here, is you see a hexagon. The first one, the second one. If there wasn't an aisle, there would be one there, and there's one here, here, and here, with one in the middle. So you can see this hexagon of these cabbages here. That enabled the spacing is such that as the plants grow and fill out the space, their leaves touch and they create a microclimate, which conserves moisture and conserves soil nutrients and prevents the sun from baking the soil and forming a crust. So the third principle of companion planting is maximizing the beneficial relationships in the garden. There's different forms of companion planting. There's companion planting plants that increase the beneficial insect populations, plants that decrease the types of pests and diseases that you might see enter a garden. There's companion plantings that maximize the root zone, the above ground zone. There's companion plantings of putting in a crop that matures, and as it's maturing you put in another crop, and it's like a relay cropping where you can harvest lots of things over the course of time out of one area. So this is another type of companion planting with including legumes. So you see here is beets, and then you see vetch. This is a type of vetch called woolly pod vetch, which in an annual agricultural system in a temperate region, this is one of the highest producers of nitrogen in the soil. There's a relationship in the legume family and the vetches with soil bacteria, where they provide food and resource for that soil bacteria, which breathes in a good living soil. The living soil breathes in the atmosphere. The atmosphere contains a lot of nitrogen in it, and those bacteria take in that nitrogen as the soil breathes it in, and they can actually alchemically metabolize and mineralize that nitrogen and make it plant available. So we all know that plants breathe through photosynthesis, but they can't access that atmospheric nitrogen. Thankfully, nature has these wonderful leguminous plants, the peas, the beans, the vetches, and they have these relationships with the bacteria that increase the amount of nitrogen cycling in the soil. So we're trying to grow a food crop here and also provide nitrogen so we don't need to add a nitrogen input, which is one of the main resources that agriculture depends on. So this is the book, How to Grow More Vegetables, written by John Jevons, the director of our nonprofit. In this book is everything you need to know to get started in your backyard garden or mini farm. One of the reasons why people love this book is it has these charts in the back, whereas pretty much any crop you can think of that grows in a temperate region, and many tropical crops as well, tells you the culture behind them, how to grow them, how to raise them in flats, when to put them in the ground, what spacing to put them in the ground on. So we know that the lettuce here, we want on 9-inch centers. We're going to overwinter this lettuce, and we're also going to save seed from it. It's easy to overwinter in the coast in California because we don't really have a freeze. But in a different, colder climate, you might want to cover these with plastic or some kind of a greenhouse. You can see here the close plant spacing, the hexagonal centers of the hexagon here with one in the middle. That's one of the most efficient shapes in nature for packing the most amount of things in the smallest space. So when we prepare the soil deeply, we can put things closer together and maximize our soil resource without destroying the soil. Here you also see companion planting. We interplanted some vetch with the lettuce because the lettuce is going to be in over the winter, and we want the vetch to fix the nitrogen with the lettuce. We also have a relay cropping in our companion planting mix of radishes, which are taking right there. And in this lettuce patch, we have some ruby streaks mustard. So we'll be harvesting food while we're waiting the lettuce to mature, and then we'll be able to eat some of the lettuce and save some for seed. We'll be harvesting the radishes while all that's happening. And we're able to get 3 crops out of one area real quick, and that's companion planting. Cool, so the next principle that we work with here in the garden after deep soil preparation, close plant spacing, companion planting is composting. And we build cold compost piles. We try not to build hot compost piles. A lot of people seem to think hot compost piles are the way to go. They limit some pests and disease. They also destroy weed seeds in the pile and things like that. But cold composting really leads to a more diverse and more abundant compost resource. It means you got to take a little longer to let that compost. A hot compost pile might be ready in a month or a month and a half, depending on how you treat it. But with a cold compost pile where you're not turning things and you're building it with a lot of crunchy structural material in there, that might take a little bit longer, like 8 months to finish, but you'll be left with more compost resource. It'll be more diverse. In a hot compost pile, when you turn it, you bring it back to the stage 1 part of composting, where it's rich in oxygen and it's favoring a certain type of microbial succession, which breaks things down really quick and releases all that carbon into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide through the respiration of those organisms. In a cold composting pile, you get through that stage one, and then you continue to move forward through a number of other stages, and what you're left with is a more diverse compost pile, which is actually the pharmacy for your garden. It has all the nutrients and different types of structures and compounds which actually help your plants thrive and help the farm ecosystem be a more healthy ecosystem. Our next principle is carbon farming. Carbon farming, 96% of what we see here is carbon in these plants. Only 4% is minerals from the water and the soil. So that 96% of carbon comes from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So these plants are breathing in our carbon dioxide, and they're fixing it into their bodies and creating that carbon structure which the nutrients hang on and express themselves as quinoa, for example. So carbon farming involves putting 60% of your growing area in these plants that not only provide an important source of calories, but they also are an important source of carbon, fixing that from the atmosphere where after the plant matures it goes into the compost pile and becomes soil, becomes cured humus. There it's held safely in the ground. That's carbon sequestration. It's something anybody can do in their backyard, and if everybody did it, not only could we stop climate change and be growing a complete diet using fewer resources than it usually takes, but we could also reverse climate change. And it's a way for everybody to get involved in this. You also see here companion planting with the cardoons, some kale, and so we're doing a number of things in here, but the carbon farming is a really important part to ensuring soil fertility. The other part of ensuring soil fertility, aside from carbon farming and composting, is actually composting human waste. Recycling human manure back into the system safely, properly, and legally is a vital, important part to closing the loop in our gardens and on our farms. And every time we eat a plant from the soil, we're mining those soil nutrients and flushing it away. If instead we compost that human waste properly and then return it to the system after a set amount of time, and ensuring that there's no human diseases or other diseases in that compost, then we can help close the cycle on our fertility and have healthier plants. So calorie farming, instead of just growing lettuce and tomatoes and things which provide an important source of nutrients and vitamins, we need to provide calories for ourselves. One of the things that we do at Ecology Action is we try and grow complete diets on the smallest amount of space possible using the fewest resources. What that means is traditionally in America it takes from 1 to 1.5 acres to grow all your own food. That's roughly about 90,000 to 110,000 square feet. We've figured out patterns that you can do to grow a complete diet using less than 1% of the land and less than 2% of the water resource in between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet. That means that in anyone's backyard you can grow all the food you need and only need to spend between 40 minutes or an hour and a half a day doing it. So all this stuff is being researched and we're growing some of it out right now. And all of that is assuming you're not going to have any pests and gophers and other disease problems in the garden, and your skill levels getting up there. So we suggest that people start small. Start with 1 bed and do it well. In 3 beds you can grow pretty much every crop that you can think of that you might want to grow in your garden. So start small and do it well. This is quinoa here. It's an important source of carbon for our compost piles. It's also an important source of calories. The quinoa in front of us here, you can see, is a smaller plant, and it produces quicker. This plant is still maturing, and I have the quinoa right here, and we're harvesting this as we go along. Now, this plant, which produces quicker, doesn't produce as much carbon in the compost pile. So each of these plants has unique properties, and getting to know these plants, these crop personalities, is an important part of reestablishing farming and gardening literacy in our culture. So the quinoa right here is really important for our source of calories. In 1 pound of quinoa, I can get 1,600 calories. I need roughly 2,400 calories in order to work in the garden every day. So the other thing that's important is I can only eat about 4 pounds of food, maybe 5 pounds if I'm really hungry. So the name of the game is, how do I get my calories in less than 5 pounds of food? So this is what we call a weight efficient source of calories. I can grow maybe 10 pounds of quinoa if I get a really good yield in 100 square feet, which means I can get 16,000 calories out of 1 growing bed. Now if I was growing something like lettuce, which only has about 60 calories per pound, I would need to eat roughly, I don't know, 30 pounds of lettuce or so in order to get my calories for the day. And we don't recommend anyone eat one type of crop, but it's important noting these differences and these different efficiencies for growing your food. Other cultures in the past didn't quantify things this way. They just did it over time and inherited it as part of their culture. So the potatoes, on the other hand, which do not provide a significant source of biomass or carbon for the compost pile, what they do provide is 200 pounds of potatoes in 100 square feet. Now the potato, and that's a good level yield, it has 350 calories per pound, roughly, depending on the type of potato. So in order to get all my calories, I would have to eat around 8 pounds of potatoes. Now I can only eat about 4. So it's important that I eat some quinoa and some potatoes in order to get all my calories and do that comfortably. So what we have here is what we call a weight efficient source of calories for calorie farming, and then we have an area efficient source of calories. The potatoes is essential, and other crops like leeks, salsify, garlic, Jerusalem artichokes, sweet potatoes, these crops grow a significant amount of calories in a small space, which when we talk about microscaling the human impact is vitally important to include at least 30% of your growing area in these high calorie, area efficient calorie crops, and 60% of your area in these weight efficient, high carbon calorie crops in order to microscale your impact. The 10% of the garden left over, we put in our normal garden vegetables of turnips, beets, carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, things like that. So you'll often see a variety of what we call 60% crops, these high carbon, high calorie crops, and then the 30% crops are special root crops that are area efficient source of calories. So the next principle we have is seed saving, and we like to save open pollinated heirloom seeds. We stay away from hybrids. Hybrids is a naturally occurring process, and it's a good thing. It's the reason why we have cabbages and broccolis and kales and collards. They all came from the wild mustard plant. So over time, things from different areas, different types of mustards, started crossing with each other. A bee would land on the flower and bring the pollen from another one, and then something unique would happen. The next generation that grew out, someone would grab that and say, hey, that's interesting. And then that becomes the Brussels sprout. And then something else comes up, and that's a collard or a kale. Something else comes up, and that's a broccoli. They're all part of the same family tree. So hybrids are a naturally occurring and good process. The hybrid industry, on the other hand, is not a healthy industry, in my opinion. The hybrid industry involves patenting and plant variety protections and different legal languages that makes it illegal to save seed for many plants. Same thing with GMOs. So we want to stay away from anything that limits people's availability of seed or ability to save seed. There's all kinds of cases where people have gotten in legal trouble for saving seeds that have patents on them. So saving seeds in your own backyard and protecting these open pollinated heirloom varieties is a simple and revolutionary act that I would advocate anyone get into. We have our seed bank here which freely distributes those seeds. So the plants want you to do it, so save the seeds and spread them around, and we're all better for it. So open pollinated means that with proper seed saving procedures, you can allow plants to grow, you can save the seeds from them, and be sure that those seeds are true to type. They are the seeds that you started with, and when you're trying to grow a complete diet, it's really important that you know what you're going to get when you're growing it. For example, if I'm growing a hybridized variety of tomatoes, I might have yellow tomatoes, red tomatoes, big tomatoes, little tomatoes, all from the same packet of seeds. The first generation of hybrids comes out true to what the parents were when they crossed, but every generation thereafter is very unstable, which provides a unique opportunity to play with those varieties and stabilize them for their unique characteristics, but the challenge for the seed saver and the gardener in terms of not knowing what you're going to get. So have fun and play with hybrids, but save those open pollinated heirloom seeds because they're a rich source of genetic diversity, and different seeds from different areas are unique to different climates and soils and very special for what they can offer the garden. So we have a solar dryer here which helps us in our cool, foggy, coastal environment in actually getting seeds to finish. So we have different sunflowers that are hanging to dry. We have in these bags different types of quinoa. This is Temuco quinoa in this bag. see in there, and that's drying out and finishing in here. And we have a black quinoa here, which you can see the black quinoa seed there. So all sorts of seeds here that we're saving and making available for our seed bank. So the last principle, the eighth principle, whole systems perspective, is, in my opinion, the most important one. It means that we're looking at the garden as a whole organism. We're looking at this as a whole system, and that every plant, every microbe, every bug has a place in here, even the pests. If we don't have some pests in our garden, we won't have beneficial insects to control those pests. So if you see aphids in the garden, that's actually a good thing. Too many aphids is not a good thing, but when you spray for those aphids, you often kill the beneficial insects as well. If you have a few aphids, you've got the food source for your beneficial insects, and if you provide the habitat for your beneficial insects, which means letting some of your plants go to flower, like carrots for example, they're an important source of food source for parasitic wasps that come and parasitize your aphids. So you can control your aphids by having a few of them around and then encouraging plants going to flowering as the food source for those parasitic wasps, which then lay their eggs in the aphids. So this is part of the whole systems perspective we're talking about here. It's incorporating all these principles and seeing the place of every organism in the garden, even the disease organisms. Any healthy organism, myself included, I have disease organisms inside of me, but I have a body that's in balance and keeping them in check. So it's important to treat your soil well. Start with a healthy soil. Maintain your soil fertility. Your plants will grow themselves and they'll be healthy. Then all of a sudden you don't need different sprays and different sorts of insect controls and other things which would harm your ecosystem. So build a healthy farm ecosystem, practice the whole systems perspective, bring all those principles together, the deep soil preparation, the close plant spacing, the composting, the companion planting, the carbon farming, the calorie farming, and the open pollinated seed saving. Use all those together and you'll have a healthy farm organism. And if you're interested in learning more about these things, you can go to www.growbiointensive.org, where we have all this information freely available and lots of important how-to videos to help you. It's all free of charge. Become a better gardener and a more sustainable